Emma Hartwell had learned a long time ago that silence was the easiest way to survive a house that did not love her back. The mansion on Cedarwood Hill was beautiful in the way that magazine photographs were beautiful. Cold, perfect, untouchable. Every room was decorated with things that cost more than most people earned in a year, and yet not a single corner of it felt like home to her. She stood in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, pouring herself a second cup of coffee, watching steam curl up from the mug like a small ghost trying to escape. Richard sat at the far end of the long dining table, his laptop open, his phone pressed between his ear and shoulder. He had been on calls since 6 a.m. He had not said good morning. He rarely did anymore. Emma watched him for a moment. The way she sometimes watched television with the sound turned off, just filling her eyes with something without really connecting to it. Richard was handsome in that severe, sharp-jawed way that photographs well. His dark hair was always neat, his suits always fitted, his entire existence always polished and pointed toward the next achievement. She used to find that drive attractive. Now it just made her feel further away from him. She set her mug down quietly and walked toward the window. Outside, the lawn was green and wide and completely still. A groundskeeper moved along the far edge with a machine that hummed softly in the early air. Emma pressed her fingertips lightly against the glass and thought about nothing in particular, which was the way she spent most of her mornings. "There's a gala on Friday," Richard said suddenly. Not looking up from his screen, Emma turned. He was still typing, still not looking at her. "Bowman is hosting it at the Meridian Hotel. All the major investors will be there. I need you to come." He paused to answer something on his phone and then went back to typing as though he had never spoken. She nodded, even though he was not watching. "Okay," she said softly. That was the whole conversation. 2 sentences and a nod, and the matter was settled. The way everything in their life was settled, quickly, practically. Without any warmth passing between them, Emma had been married to Richard for 7 years. In those 7 years, she had attended 30 or 40 of these events. She knew exactly how they went. She would wear something Richard approved of, something long and subdued and expensive in a way that reflected well on him. She would stand at his side when it mattered and drift pleasantly in the background when it did not. She would smile at the right people and say the right things. And by the end of the night, nobody would remember her name. She had not always been this way. There was a version of Emma Hartwell that used to laugh too loudly at parties and dance without being asked, wore colors that made people turn their heads. She had been a graphic designer with her own small studio before the marriage. She had been sharp and funny and full of opinions. Somewhere in the long, quiet years of being Richard's wife, that version of her had gone very still. On Wednesday, Diane Whitmore showed up at the house unannounced, which was the only way Diane did anything. She came in with 2 lattes and a shopping bag, and the kind of energy that made rooms feel warmer the moment she entered them. She was Emma's oldest friend, a woman who ran a small boutique in the Arts District, and wore her curly hair like she had invented confidence. "Friday," Diane said, dropping onto the living room sofa and handing Emma a cup. "I heard about the gala. What are you wearing?" Emma gestured vaguely toward the hallway where her closet held a row of long, dark dresses that Richard had selected over the years. Diane followed her gaze and made a sound that was not quite a word, but communicated her feelings very clearly. "No," Diane said simply. "Diane." "Emma, no. Not another one of those. You look like a curtain in those dresses." She reached into the shopping bag and pulled out something folded in soft tissue paper. "I want you to try this on." Emma unfolded it slowly. It was a dress, deep burgundy, short, cut cleanly along the lines of someone who understood exactly how a woman's body should be celebrated. The fabric was soft and sophisticated. It was not revealing in any cheap way. It was simply honest about the fact that the person wearing it had a body worth acknowledging. Emma held it against herself in front of the hallway mirror and felt something strange and quiet move through her chest. "Richard will hate it," she said. "Good," Diane replied. She came and stood beside Emma in the mirror, looking at their reflections together. "Emma, when is the last time you wore something for yourself?" Emma did not answer because the answer was a number too large to say out loud. She tried the dress, on in her bedroom with the door closed. When she looked at herself, really looked, she barely recognized the woman in the glass. The dress fell just above her knees. Her legs looked long. Her shoulders looked like they belonged to someone who had decided to take up space. Her brown hair fell loose around her face, and for the first time in a very long time, she thought, she looked like a person rather than a backdrop. She kept looking for a long time. Diane helped her pick. Shoes on Thursday evening. Simple black heels that were elegant without screaming for attention. They practiced walking, which made them both laugh. The first real laughing Emma had done in weeks. Diane did her makeup on Friday afternoon, nothing theatrical, just enough to let the light catch the warmth in Emma's brown eyes and the soft curve of her lips. Richard came home at 5:30 to change. He moved through the bedroom without looking at her, selecting his cufflinks and his tie in the focused, efficient way he did everything. Emma stood at the mirror adding a final touch of perfume, a rich warm scent that Diane had brought from the boutique, and waited. She heard him pause behind her. She turned around. Richard looked at her for a long moment, his expression doing something complicated that she could not quite read. Then his jaw tightened. "That dress is too short," he said. "I like it," Emma replied. And the words came out steady, which surprised her. "We are going to a professional event?" "Emma, I know where we are going." Something passed between them in the silence after that. Richard looked like he wanted to say more, but something in the way she was standing, straight-backed, cum-faced, made him press his lips together instead. He turned away and picked up his jacket. In the car, he said nothing. Emma watched the city lights come alive outside her window as the driver moved through the Friday evening traffic. The Meridian Hotel rose ahead of them, glass and gold light pouring from its upper floors into the dark sky. She could hear the low pulse of music from outside as they pulled up. The valet opened her door and Emma stepped out. She stood on the pavement for one breath, two, feeling the cool night air on her bare arms and the solid ground beneath her heels. Then she walked forward through the entrance and into the light. And several things happened at once. Heads turned. Conversations paused. A woman near the coat check looked over her shoulder. A man in a gray suit stopped mid-dash sentence. Emma did not slow down. She kept walking, and for the first time in 7 years she did not feel like a curtain or a shadow or a photograph on someone else's wall. She felt like herself, and across the grand hall of the Meridian Hotel, standing near the bar with a glass of bourbon in his hand, a tall man with warm brown eyes and a quiet, observant face watched her walk in and did not look away. The Meridian Hotel ballroom was the kind of room that had been designed to make people feel important. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling so high it seemed to belong to another world. The tables were dressed in ivory linen with tall floral arrangements that smelled faintly of white roses and cedar. Soft orchestral music moved through the air like water, filling the spaces between conversations without demanding attention. Servers moved through the crowd with practiced elegance, and everywhere Emma looked, there were people performing the best versions of themselves. She had been 2 rooms like this dozens of times. She had never once felt like she belonged in one until tonight. Richard had already been absorbed by Charles Bowman and a cluster of men in dark suits near the far side of the room. He had walked with her to the entrance, placed his hand briefly at the small of her back in a gesture that was more territorial than tender, and then drifted away the moment he spotted someone worth talking to. Emma had watched him go without surprise. This was the pattern. This had always been the pattern. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and stood quietly for a moment. Taking in the room, Patricia Langston appeared at her left elbow almost immediately, the way Patricia always did at these events. Drawn by some instinct for social positioning. She was a slim woman in her mid-40s, with sharp cheekbones and the kind of expensive highlights that required a great deal of maintenance to look effortless. She air-kissed near Emma's cheek and stepped back with a smile that carried exactly the warmth of a marble countertop. "Darling," she said, her eyes moving quickly from Emma's face down to the dress and back up again. "You look different tonight." "Thank you," Emma said pleasantly. Patricia's smile tightened at the edges in the small way. That meant she had intended it as an observation rather than a compliment. She recovered quickly, pivoting toward a nearby group of women and drawing Emma partway into the conversation with the casual cruelty of someone who expected to remain the most interesting person in any circle. Emma listened politely, contributed occasionally, and noticed without particular distress that two of the women in the group were looking at her, with something that resembled genuine curiosity rather than the usual polite blankness. One of them, a woman named Gloria, who ran a non-profit arts foundation, leaned slightly toward Emma. "That color is incredible on you," Gloria said quietly. "Where did you find that dress?" "A friend has a boutique," Emma said. Something warm moved through her chest at the simplicity of that exchange. She was still talking with Gloria when she became aware of someone watching her. It was not the casual glancing over that happened when you entered a crowded room. It was steady and deliberate, and she felt it before she saw it. The way you feel a source of heat before you turn toward it. She looked across the room. He was standing near the mahogany bar, tall and unhurried, with the kind of ease that did not need to announce itself. He had dark hair that was just slightly longer than business convention recommended, warm brown eyes that were clearly intelligent, and a suit that fitted him the way suits fit men who do not think about their suits. He was holding a glass of bourbon at his side, rather than in front of him. The small difference of a man who was comfortable enough not to use it as a prop. When her eyes met his, he did not look away. And he did not pretend he had been looking at something else. He simply held her gaze with a small and genuine half-smile. Emma looked away first, not from shyness exactly, but because the directness of it caught her off guard. 30 seconds later, he was walking toward her. He did it without urgency, stopping briefly to exchange a word with a man near the pillar, which somehow made the approach feel less like a line and more like the natural movement of a person making their way through a room. When he reached her, he extended his hand. "Sebastian Cole," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not need a room to be quiet to fill it, and shook his hand. His grip was firm and brief, and he did not hold on longer than was natural. "I don't think we've met before," he said, "though I've been to enough of Beaumont's events that I feel like I've met everyone twice over by now." Emma found herself smiling before she had decided to. "He does host a lot of these," does Sebastian agreed, "though this one is better than most." He glanced around the room with an expression that was neither impressed nor dismissive. Better music. Worse flowers. Emma looked at the tall floral arrangements and laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from the center of her chest rather than the polite surface of her face. "The flowers are terrible," she agreed. "They're trying too hard." Sebastian looked at her as though she had said something that delighted him. "Exactly that," he said. "Trying too hard." We talked for 20 minutes. She could not afterward have said exactly what they talked about, only that it moved easily, from art to cities, to the absurdity of certain corporate traditions, and that at no point did she feel the need to make herself smaller or quieter or more agreeable than she actually was. Sebastian Cole had the rare quality of listening as though what you were saying was the most interesting available option in the room, not because he was performing interest, but because he actually seemed to possess it. She did not notice Richard until she heard his voice. Emma came from just behind her left shoulder, tight and controlled in the way that meant he was not controlled at all. She turned. Richard stood with his hands loose at his sides and his jaw set at the angle she recognized as fury, being carefully dressed in civility. His eyes moved between her and Sebastian with the speed of a calculation. "Richard," Emma said calmly, "this is Sebastian Cole." "I know who Sebastian Cole is," Richard said, extending his hand to Sebastian with a smile that did not reach any part of his face above the mouth. "Hartwell. We spoke at the Infrastructure Summit last spring," of course Sebastian said, shaking his hand with an easy nod. His expression was pleasant and unreadable and gave nothing away. The three of them stood in a triangle for a moment, and Emma felt the temperature of it as clearly as if the air had changed. Richard placed his hand on Emma's arm. "They're about to start the presentations. We should find our seats." Emma looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at it the way you look at something that does not quite belong to you anymore. In a moment, she said, Richard's fingers tightened slightly. She felt it and remained perfectly still. It was nice to meet you, Sebastian, she said, turning back with a warmth that was entirely natural. You as well, Emma, Sebastian said. He held her gaze for one quiet second. I hope the rest of your evening is exactly what you deserve. It was a simple sentence. Emma carried it with her to the table, like something precious. The presentations lasted 40 minutes. Emma sat beside Richard, and he did not speak to her or look at her for the first 30 of them. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her back straight, and her mind very clear and calm. During the applause between speakers, Richard leaned toward her. What were you doing talking to Cole for that long? Having a conversation, Emma said quietly. You looked like you were performing. She turned to look at him then, fully and directly, and something in her expression made him blink. I look like a person, she said. I think you've forgotten what that looks like. Richard sat back and said nothing more for the remainder of the evening. After the presentations, there was dancing. Emma had not planned to dance. A younger man from the Spanish investment group, friendly and enthusiastic, asked her with such cheerful politeness that she accepted before she thought about it. And then she was on the floor with the music around, her and her heels firm on the parquet, and she felt something she had almost forgotten the name of: free. She felt free. From across the room, she was aware of Richard watching. She did not perform for him or against him. She simply danced, and the dancing was only about her own body moving through space with pleasure, and that was enough. When she came back to the edge of the floor, flushed and lightly breathless, Sebastian was standing nearby with 2 glasses of sparkling water. He offered her one without making it a gesture about anything other than the obvious fact that she was warm and might want water. You dance like someone who used to do it more, he said. I did, Emma admitted. I stopped. Why? She considered lying or deflecting. She did not. I let someone make me believe I wasn't worth watching. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Then he said very simply, that seems like it was a significant loss. For everyone in the room, Emma looked at him and felt something shift quietly in her chest. Not the dramatic shattering of a wall, but the gentle opening of a window that had been painted shut. Richard appeared at her side within 2 minutes, and this time there was no pretense of civility in his expression. He took her arm and steered her firmly toward the hallway. We are leaving, he said. Emma went with him because the night had already given her everything she had come for. Not Sebastian, not attention, not revenge. Something older and more important than any of those things. She had found her own voice in a crowded room and used it. No one could take that back from her now. The drive home from the Meridian Hotel was the longest 20 minutes of Emma Hartwell's life, and also in some ways the most clarifying. Richard drove. He had insisted on taking the wheel from the driver, which was what he always did when he needed the illusion of control. His hands were tight on the wheel, and his breathing was the measured kind that meant he was working very hard to keep his words inside, until he had chosen them carefully enough to cause the maximum amount of damage with the minimum amount of exposure. Emma sat in the passenger seat and watched the city lights pass. She felt very calm. Not the hollow, resigned calm of someone who had given up, but the deep, rooted calm of someone who had finally found the ground under their feet and discovered it was solid. Richard spoke first. You embarrassed me tonight. Emma said nothing. In front of Cole, in front of Bowman, in front of the entire room. Standing there like that, talking to men you don't know, laughing like it was your personal party. His voice was getting louder as the restraint began to slip. 7 years, I have given you everything. Emma, everything. And you chose tonight to act like some woman who has no idea how to conduct herself. Emma let him finish. Then she said quietly, I conducted myself exactly as a person should. You made a spectacle. I had conversations. I smiled at people. I danced once. She turned to look at his profile. Richard, you have a problem with the fact that people noticed me tonight. Say that instead. The muscle in his jaw jumped. I have a problem with my wife behaving as though she's available. Your wife, Emma said. And the way she said it made the phrase sound like something being held up to the light to examine its actual weight. Not Emma. Not a person. Your wife. He said nothing to that. They reached the house in silence. Inside, the rooms were dim and cool and smelled of the cut flowers that were replaced every week by a service Richard had set up years ago, another gesture of provision that had never once required him to be present. Emma stood in the living room and took off her heels, setting them neatly by the door. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark garden for a moment. Feeling the cool wood floor under her bare feet, Richard came to stand in the center of the room. He looked like a man who had rehearsed a speech on the drive home and was now discovering that the speech was wrong for the room it was being delivered in.
"Oh, you need to understand,"
he started, "that my reputation is tied to you. When you act a certain way in public, it reflects on the business, on my relationships, on everything I've spent my life building." Emma turned from the window. "And what about my life, Richard?" He stopped. "What have I spent 7 years building? What has been constructed in my name?" She was not angry. The absence of anger surprised her, and then did not surprise her. Because anger required the belief that the other person was worth being angry at. In the same way you were angry at a storm or a betrayal, what she felt instead was something closer to grief, clean and honest. "I gave up my studio. I gave up my friends, most of them. I gave up the version of myself that I liked best. And in return, I got a beautiful house and a husband who cannot remember the last time he asked me how I was feeling." Richard sat down heavily on the sofa. He rubbed the back of his neck in the gesture she had always associated with him processing information he did not want to process. "Emma," he said finally, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, her name in his mouth sounded like it meant something to him. "I didn't know you felt this way. You didn't ask," she said simply. "You never ask." The silence that followed was different from the silences they usually shared. Those silences were comfortable for him and suffocating for her. This one was equal. It pressed on both of them with the same weight. "I don't know how to do this differently," he said, and it was the most honest thing she had heard him say in years. Not an apology exactly, but an admission. And admissions from Richard Hartwell were rarer and more expensive than any Kohler or arrangement of flowers. "I know you don't," she said. "That's the problem." She went to bed before him that night and lay in the large, cool room and stared at the ceiling. She thought about Sebastian Cole and the way he had listened to her, not with the practiced patience of someone waiting for a pause in which to redirect the conversation, but with real attention, the kind that made you feel that what you were saying had value because you were the one saying it. She was not naive. One conversation at a charity gala was not a relationship. Sebastian Cole was a stranger with kind eyes and an easy way about him, but he had shown her something important without meaning to. He had shown her what it felt like to be treated as a full person, and that was a thing she could not know. In the morning, Emma woke early and made coffee herself in the big kitchen. She sat at the small table near the garden window, not the long formal dining table where Richard held court each morning, and she wrote in a notebook that she had not opened in 2 years. She wrote without a plan, just the honest streaming of things she had kept inside so long they had started to lose their shape. She wrote about her old studio and the smell of ink and the satisfaction of designing something from nothing. She wrote about Diane and how much she missed having a person in her daily life who saw her clearly. She wrote about the feeling of dancing in the hotel ballroom and how her body had remembered something her mind had tried to forget. Richard came down at 7:30 and stopped in the doorway when he saw her. She looked up at him with the open, steady gaze that had become her new default, the one that did not apologize for taking up space. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said carefully. As though the phrase itself was newly complicated, he poured his own coffee and came to sit not at the long table, but at the small one, across from her. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. He looked at the notebook. "You used to do that," he said. "Right in the mornings?" "I stopped when we got married," Emma said. "I told myself I didn't have time, but you had time." "I had time," she agreed. "I just stopped believing my own thoughts were worth writing down." Richard was quiet for a long moment. He wrapped both hands around his mug and stared at the surface of the coffee. "I did that to you," he said. "It was not a question. You helped," Emma said. "But I let it happen." I own that part. The honesty of it seemed to land on him differently than the accusations of the night before. He nodded slowly, like a man taking inventory of damage and trying to calculate if repair was possible. 3 days later, a message came through Emma's phone from a number she did not recognize. When she opened it, she saw that it was from Sebastian Cole, who had apparently asked Charles Bowman's assistant for her contact information, which was forward in a way that was also somehow not uncomfortable. The message was brief. It said that he was putting together a small committee for an arts funding initiative, and that Bowman had mentioned she had a background in graphic design. And would she be interested in hearing more about it? Emma read it twice. Then she smiled. A slow and private smile that had nothing to do with Richard and everything to do with herself. She replied that she would be happy to hear more. She did not tell Richard about the message that day. Not because she was hiding it, but because it was hers. A small and significant thing that belonged to her. And she was still learning that she was allowed to have things that were simply hers. That evening, she called Diane. "I want to open the studio again," she said. Before Diane could even say hello properly, there was a pause, and then Diane made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "I have been waiting 7 years to hear that sentence," she said. Emma looked out the window of her room at the wide, dark garden. Richard was downstairs in his study, on a call, as always. But tonight the sound of his voice through the floor did not feel like something pressing down on her. It was simply a sound in the house, one of many. No more weighted than the clock or the wind outside. She did not know yet what the coming months would look like. She did not know whether Richard was capable of the kind of change that their marriage would need to survive, or whether the marriage was even the thing worth saving. She did not know where Sebastian Cole's message would lead, or whether it would lead anywhere beyond a professional acquaintance, who happened to have kind eyes. What she knew was simpler than any of that, and more important, she knew who she was. She had found that out in a hotel ballroom, in a burgundy dress, while the orchestra played, and the crystal chandeliers scattered light across the floor. And no amount of silence or indifference could take that back from her now. Emma. Hartwell stood at her window in the dark, and breathed in and breathed out, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the future was something she was walking toward, rather than something that was simply happening to her, and that, she thought, was the only beginning that mattered.